So you just heard the news that Brandon Sanderson is getting a Cosmere universe movie/TV deal with Apple TV, and you're wondering, where should I start with reading his Cosmere? Well, hopefully this is the video for you. I have my suggested reading order, which is also the reading order that I read the Cosmere in, and I thought it'd be a good idea to share with you guys the knowledge I've gained over the past year of reading the Cosmere. I will be transparent, I do have about 6 Cosmere reads left to read personally, but I feel really confident in sharing this reading order with you guys. I've done a ton of research and thought a lot about this process and what I think would be best, and obviously gathered other people's ideas of what they think would be best. So without further ado, this is my official Cosmere reading order. Oh, and just in case you don't know what the Cosmere is, think MCU, but books. Basically every single book, well, most of the books Brandon Sanderson have written are all in this planet system called the Cosmere, which means characters can overlap, themes can overlap. There is definitely books in here where the overlap is way heavier than other books, but we will discuss that once we get into the reading order. But yeah, basically think MCU, but books. And it's really good and it's really crazy, and catching those little connections and Easter eggs is some of the most fun I've ever had reading. There are several places within Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere that you can start your journey. There are 3, probably, or maybe 4 main suggestions that people make when they suggest where to start in the Cosmere. That would be the Stormlight Archive, Tress of the Emerald Sea, Mistborn, or I feel like you could realistically start with Warbreaker as well. That just kind of depends on the vibe you're looking for. Warbreaker is going to be a little bit of a semi-standalone romantic story, so that would be a good suggestion for people who like romance-driven plots. Stormlight Archive is going to be super high fantasy, but those books are super long, and by the end of the series they do have a little bit more of Cosmere crossovers, so you can start there. Personally, I wouldn't suggest it. Mistborn is a fantastic place to start, but it is a start of a trilogy, so you have to kind of go in with the expectation that if you like it, you are committing to a full trilogy, which granted, if you're watching this video, most likely you are down to commit to the whole Cosmere, but personally, the place I like to start is Tress of the Emerald Sea. This was the first Brandon Sanderson I personally ever read. I think this is a good starting place because it is a familiar story. It is a slight retelling of The Princess Bride, so if you're familiar with that movie or book at all, you probably are going to be familiar with the plot of this a little bit. So this is like a slight standalone comfort read for a lot of people. I will say, I think it is one of those books that can definitely be enjoyed by itself, but there's also a place that I'll mention later on in this, reading order that I do think it would be good to reread this if you read it first. That is personally my plan. That being said, this follows Tress as she goes off on an adventure with some pirates to save the love of her life. And she collects cups, which is just really fun. If you don't want to start with Tress though, or if you're following my order, the next books you are going to pick up anyways would be the Mistborn trilogy. That goes The Final Empire. This is Mistborn, The Final Empire. Sometimes it just says The Final Empire. My original copy just said The Final Empire, but you'll see both. This is the first book in the trilogy. It follows Vin and Kelsier as they use their magic to, save the world. Basically, what happens if the bad guy won and now people are trying to get rid of him. So this trilogy is like a heist meets found family meets what if the bad guy won meets awesome world building and magic. Like, the magic system in here is very unique. After that, you would pick up the second book in the Mistborn trilogy. This is The Well of Ascension. This follows Vin and Kelsier as they continue their adventure. And then last but not least, you have The Hero of Ages. This is the third and final book in the original Mistborn trilogy. I sobbed. Be prepared. After finishing The Hero of Ages, you're going to hop on over to the Arcanum Unbounded. This is a collection of Cosmere short stories, and you are going to read The 11th Metal. This is a story that technically takes place before The Final Empire, but I believe it is best to be read after the trilogy is complete. So that's when I would suggest to read it. And then personally, after that, I would recommend reading Secret History. This one is one that's very divisive among fans of where to read it. Personally, I like reading it here because the events of the trilogy are still super fresh in your mind, and I think that this story hits super hard with those events still fresh in your mind. A lot of people say that this does contain a spoiler for Era 2 of Mistborn, which personally I haven't experienced yet, but I do think that I enjoyed reading this when I did because I still remembered the characters, what happened, etc., and I would recommend doing the same. After that, I would personally recommend going into Elantris. This was Brandon Sanderson's very first published work, so it is a little bit rougher, which is why I wouldn't recommend starting with it. It is a little, rough around the edges. He was still developing himself as an author. But that being said, it is still super important to the Cosmere. It's still super good. It's just not the best starting place, even though it did come out first, technically. But anywho, I recommend reading Elantris. This is super good. It is technically right now a standalone, but hopping back over to the Arcanum Unbounded, there is a short story that goes along with Elantris. It is called The Hope of Elantris. It's like literally 11 pages. It's a super quick and easy read, but it does kind of give more context to the world. And after reading The Hope of Elantris, this is when I personally find it's best to hop on over to The Emperor's Soul. Some people read this later on. I believe it is a standalone novel, so it doesn't really matter when you read it, to my understanding. Please don't quote me on that. But this is The Emperor's Soul. It takes place on Sel, which is the same planet as Elantris, so it has a little bit of the same lore and magic system, but I do believe this is a standalone, complete story. It is super short too. It's literally only 140 pages. Also, technically The Emperor's Soul could be a good first book to read in Brandon's universe. I had a friend of mine recently start with this and he loved it. It has a lot of undertones of religion and self-discovery and what does it mean to be alive, and so I do think that this is another really good entrance into the Cosmere if you want to choose this one. But since it does relate to Elantris, for me, I read it here. After that, we are going to go hop on over to Warbreaker. Again, if you didn't start with Warbreaker, like I mentioned earlier, this is a slight standalone romance story, basically. It has probably the most romance of any of Brandon's works that I've personally read so far. It is about two sisters. One has been trained to be a queen and the other has been trained to basically stay at home and do nothing, and their roles get reversed last minute. So we follow them as they do things they never thought they were going to do, and obviously there's chaos and romance along the way, and it is super good. It is one of my favorite Brandon Sanderson works. But this work, while being a standalone, does technically relate to the Stormlight Archive later on in the books. So you can either read this here, which is what I personally did, or read it, I believe, after Words of Radiance. I would personally recommend reading it here though, because catching those, Cosmere connections were some of the most fun I've had reading, and I would highly recommend doing the same. After that, we are finally into Brandon Sanderson's best work, in my opinion. It is the work he's probably the most known for. That is the Stormlight Archive. This is book 1, The Way of Kings. It is a big book, okay? So go into this with an open mind. We follow 4 or 5 main POVs as they explore what does the world look like when you're constantly at war and stuff just doesn't go right. This is a world plagued with storms. They happen every week or so, and yeah, it's super good. I really, really, really love this, like I said. I will say though, I don't recommend starting with this because I personally had so much fun catching the other Cosmere connections because I had all these other books under my belt first. So, Stormlight Archive. After that, I would recommend hopping back over to the Arcanum Unbounded and reading The Sixth of the Dusk. This technically doesn't have any Stormlight Archive specific connections, but I do think it's fun to have a little bit of a palate cleanser here. But also, there are some connections you'll catch a little bit later on, so this is just a nice place to slot it in, which this short story does relate to a book directly that we'll talk about later. After that, we'll read The Words of Radiance. This is probably the best book I've ever read in my life. It is the highest rated book on Goodreads, and for a reason. This is the second book of the Stormlight Archive. This has some of the best character growth and battle scenes I've ever read in my whole entire life. It is phenomenal. I would definitely recommend picking it up here because going from book 1 to 2, so much happens, and I think it's good to have it still kind of fresh on your brain. After Words of Radiance, I would go ahead and pick up this little flip novella here if you can find it. I believe it's on Brandon Sanderson's Dragonsteel website that I'll link below. It is King Lopen the First of Alucard and Elsecaller, these are two stories that take place with certain characters that happen at the same time as Words of Radiance. You get a little bit more context to their stories. I really enjoyed Elsecaller. King Lopin, not as much, but I would still definitely recommend reading them and reading them here. After that, you're going to pick up the novella Edge Dancer. I do believe that this novella is also in the Arcanum Unbounded, so you don't need this cutie little physical copy like I have, but this follows another character that we meet in Words of Radiance. This gives a little bit background of her story. Heads up though, if you do buy the physical copy, the first 60-ish pages are the exact same as the interlude that follows this character in the Words of Radiance. So if you don't want to reread it, you don't have to, but if you want to, be my guest. After Edge Dancer, we are going to pick up Oathbringer. This is the third book of the Stormlight Archive. Again, we just follow our characters as more things happen to them, as they, continue to live their lives. We follow our main characters once again, and it's just really good. I will say this one is a big book. I did struggle with this one a little bit personally, so that is why I would recommend. After Oathbringer is a fantastic time to start Era 2 of Mistborn. Like I said, if you're like me, you probably got a little bit of a Stormlight Archive reading slump. I just got a little burnt out. The books are so long that I needed just a little palate cleanser, but I wanted to remain in the Cosmere. So I personally picked up the Alloy of Law next. This is the first book in Mistborn Era 2. We follow Wax and Wayne. They follow the same magic system in the same world as Era 1, but it's now couple of 100 years in the future. There is guns, and it's more of a Western crime fighting vibe. It's super fun, super different vibe to any of Brandon's other works. It's very heavy on the humor, but that is why I think it is a perfect book to read right now as a little palate cleanser to the Stormlight Archive. After the Alloy of Law, you're going to go back to the Arcanum Unbounded, and this is when we are going to read Almancer Jack and the Pits of Atlantia. This book is like a comic book style story of what happens kind of during the Alloy of Law, I believe, or maybe like close timeline. I'm not really sure. Also, this would be a good time for me to go ahead and mention the Arcanum Unbounded also has copies of Mistborn: A Secret History and The Emperor's Soul. You don't need the little physical copies like I had if you have this copy. I just thought I should throw that in here while we're talking about it. After that, I went ahead and picked up Dawn Shard. You could technically read this immediately after Oathbringer, but like I mentioned, I personally needed a little bit of a break. This book does happen between Oathbringer and Rhythm of War, so as long as you read it sometime between the two of those, you are fine. This one is not in the Arcanum Unbounded though. I do not know if you can get it anywhere other than this little physical copy, but these aren't very expensive. They're like $13 at Barnes & Noble, so I'd recommend picking up a copy and reading this little story. It takes place, like I mentioned, between Oathbringer and Rhythm of War, and it, again, gives context to one of the characters that we meet in Oathbringer. Right now is also, like I mentioned, when I would recommend maybe doing a Tress of the Emerald Sea reread, or if you don't start with Tress, this would be a good time to slot it in. Again, just as a little palate cleanser, these individual stories work well as palate cleansers. They don't necessarily have a strict timeline in which you need to read them, but I do recommend saving them for moments like this when you might be feeling a little burnt out. Next, we are going to pick up Shadows of Self. This is book 2 in Mistborn Era 2. This follows, again, just our main characters as they go on a little adventure. Stuff goes wrong, like always. And this is, again, just a humorous little short story. I love Mistborn Era 2. Highly recommend that you don't skip it. A lot of people will tell you to skip it. Don't listen to them. Next, we're going to pick up the Bands of Mourning. This is the third book in Mistborn Era 2. Again, just a fun little quick read, kind of emotional though, be warned. After that, I pick up Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. This follows two of our main characters as they switch lives and kind of do the other person's life. I don't even know how to describe it. It is a crazy little wacky story. Actually, I lied earlier. This is probably Brandon Sanderson's most romantic work. It is literally described as a romantasy by a lot of readers. It is, again, one of those standalone stories that you can technically slot in anywhere, but I would recommend leaving this towards the end of your reading journey because I personally found a lot of Cosmere connections, even though they were subtle. Do with that information what you will. Again, I do think you could start with this one though. Okay, and now we're getting into the books that I personally have not read yet, so if this reading order ends up changing, I will make a follow-up video, but as of right now, this is my planned reading order for the rest of the Cosmere. The next book I'm going to pick up is The Rhythm of War. This is book 4 of the Stormlight Archive. Again, this is a really big book, so I'm a little scared personally, but I've heard that this one is really fun. It has a lot of emotional stories, so I've been told, so I'm really excited to dive into this one. I believe it is a slightly different tone to the rest of the books, though. So, Stormlight Archive, number 4. I also want to go ahead and mention that the reason I'm doing this specific Cosmere reading order for these last couple of books is because I will say that I have noticed that as we're getting into these kind of last few books, the Cosmere connections are starting to get very, very heavy. So I personally wouldn't recommend, you know, just blasting through all of the Stormlight Archive or doing all of Mistborn Era 2, etc. because I do feel like you will miss some of the connections. And like I mentioned earlier, some of the most fun I've had reading has been discovering those connections. So my next book, The Lost Metal. This is the 4th and final book in Mistborn Era 2. This is supposed to be one of Brandon's more like emotional reads, so I'm a little scared, but I have heard that there are tons and tons and tons of Cosmere connections in this one, which is why, again, I wouldn't recommend reading the Mistborn Era 2 back to back. So that's The Lost Metal. After that, I plan to go to the Arcanum Unbounded, I believe for the last time, to read Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. That is such a long title, but I don't really know what that story is about personally, but I have been told to kind of read it here-ish, so that's what I plan to do. After that, you can either pick up Stormlight Archive Book 5, Wind and Truth, or The Sunlit Man. I believe, personally, I'm going to follow the reading order where you read The Sunlit Man next. I have heard that the reason you want to kind of pick your battles with this one is this book does spoil a reveal that happens in Wind and Truth, but I've heard a lot of people say that it is a stronger book if you read it first. I'm not really sure. Let me know down in the comments below if you feel really strongly one way or the other if you're watching this and have already read the Cosmere. I would love to know other people's opinions on this, but after doing a ton of research, like I said, I have kind of gotten the consensus that most people read this first and really enjoy that reading order, which means after that I will be picking up Wind and Truth. This is the 5th and final currently published Stormlight Archive book. I am so excited and so scared of this book. It is so big. I don't know what to think, and I really hope it's really, really good. I've heard mixed reviews, but we're going to figure that out for ourselves. And then the last and final book that we will be reading that is currently published as of 2026 when I'm recording this video is Isles of the Emberdark. This book literally just came out back in like December for the Dragonsteel version, and then I got mine in the mail literally yesterday for the just like traditional hardcover. This book follows Six of the Dusk. If you remember, we read his short story earlier in our reading journey. This book is just like a continuation and an expansion on that. But I will say I have been told by plenty of people that this book is very, very heavy on the Cosmere connections, so I wouldn't read it unless you have read pretty much everything else. I have kind of already started to guess on what those Cosmere connections are, and I will say I do think you need to read at the very least Stormlight Archive before you pick this up. There is also a comic book that is currently published called White Sands, to my knowledge, that is Cosmere but not super heavy. There is an excerpt of the White Sands in the Arcanum Unbounded. You can go ahead and read that. You can also sometimes find the audiobooks on sale on Audible. That being said, the comic itself is incredibly hard to find, and I think that you could skip it if you want to, so do with that information what you will. I will say though, a lot of reading orders I read said to read it kind of in that Elantris Warbreaker time zone, so I personally haven't read it yet, but oh well, I guess. Also, I want to go ahead and put in a disclaimer. There's no definitive reading order for the Cosmere. This is just kind of the reading order that I did and what I found the most fun, because like I said, I do enjoy finding those connections, but I think the only hard set rule is please don't read Mistborn Era 2 before you read Mistborn Era 1. I think that's the only, you know, strongly advised rule. I think everything else is relatively flexible, but like I said, if you follow the reading order that I have presented in this video, I do think you will hopefully also find lots of fun Cosmere connections. I do have several videos here on my channel of me explaining the Cosmere connections that I have personally found, and some fun reading vlogs and stuff like that if you are curious and want to come back to those once you have started your Cosmere journey. So without further ado, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. If you have any questions about the Cosmere or want to chat, please hit me up. Leave a comment down below, leave a like and subscribe. I make Cosmere related content occasionally over here on my channel, and I'd love for you to come back. But like I mentioned, thank you so much for watching today's video, and I will catch you in the next one.